The encounter. Ethan Carter groaned as he pushed himself up from the ground. His head throbbed, and his spacesuit was covered in dust. Sparks crackled from the wreckage of his ship behind him. The crash had been rough, but he was alive. That was something. He looked around. The planet was a wasteland. Dry, cracked ground stretched for miles under a dark purple sky. Jagged rocks and dead trees stood like broken bones. No signs of life. No water. No food. Ethan sighed. He tapped his wrist communicator. Mayday, mayday. This is Ethan Carter. Ship down, requesting immediate rescue. Only static answered him. He clenched his jaw. He had to find shelter before nightfall. His oxygen would last a few days, but his food supply was limited. If he didn't find a way to fix his ship or call for help, he was as good as dead. A faint sound. Ethan took slow, careful steps across the cracked terrain. His boots crunched against the dry ground. The air was thin, making it hard to breathe. Then he heard something. A sound so faint he almost thought he imagined it. A whisper. A soft, trembling breath. Ethan froze. His heart pounded. He wasn't alone. He turned his head slowly. Behind a large rock, something moved. Something alive. Cautiously, he stepped closer. He peered around the rock, his breath catching in his throat. A woman, or at least something that looked like a woman. She was slumped against the rock, barely moving. Her skin was pale blue, with faint silver patterns running along her arms. Her hair, long and white, clung to her face. Her eyes, large and dark, flickered weakly. She was dying. A desperate choice. Ethan hesitated. He had never seen an alien before. Sure, humanity had talked about them, searched for them, but nothing had ever been confirmed. Yet here she was. And she was starving. Ethan reached into his survival pack, pulling out a protein bar. It wasn't much, but it could keep someone alive for a while. He knelt down. "Can you hear me?" he asked. His voice sounded strange in the quiet. Her eyes barely opened. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Ethan unwrapped the protein bar. Carefully, he broke off a small piece and held it near her mouth. "Eat," he said softly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the last of her strength, she lifted a trembling hand and took the piece. As soon as the food touched her tongue, her entire body shuddered. Her fingers clenched, her chest rose sharply, and tears welled in her eyes. Ethan watched, stunned, as the silver patterns on her skin began to glow faintly. It was as if the food had ignited something inside her. She swallowed, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She whispered something, her voice hoarse. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the emotion behind them was clear. Relief, gratitude, hope. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something unspoken yet powerful. And at that moment, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The awakening. Ethan sat beside the alien woman, watching as she slowly chewed the small piece of food. He had seen hunger before, on war-torn planets, in deep space stations where supplies ran low. But this was different. This was desperation. Her fingers trembled as she reached for more, but her body was so weak she could barely lift her hand. Ethan gently placed another piece of the protein bar in her palm. She ate it slowly, tears still slipping down her pale blue cheeks. Ethan had so many questions. Who was she? How long had she been here? Was she the only one left? But he didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, he sat in silence, watching her regain just a little bit of strength. First words. Minutes passed. Her breathing steadied. The soft glow on her skin didn't fade. Then her lips moved again. A whisper. At first, Ethan thought she was speaking another language. But then he realized she was struggling to form words. Her throat was dry, her voice weak. She swallowed hard and then tried again. Thank you. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. She had spoken, in his language. You, Understand me?" he asked cautiously. The woman nodded weakly. "A little." Ethan exhaled, feeling a strange weight lift off his chest. This changes everything. Not only was she alive, but she could communicate. He glanced at the barren landscape around them. "Is there anyone else here?" he asked. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she closed her eyes and shook her head. Ethan felt a chill. She was alone, the last survivor. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This planet wasn't just empty, it was a graveyard. "How long have you been here?" he asked softly. The woman hesitated. Her gaze drifted to the cracked ground. "Long time," she whispered. She lifted a trembling hand and drew a rough shape in the dust. At first, Ethan thought it was just a random pattern, but then he saw what she was doing. A circle, and inside it, 4 smaller circles. "4?" Ethan asked, pointing at the smaller shapes. She nodded. Ethan's stomach twisted. She wasn't alone at first. There were 4 others. He looked at the drawing, his chest tightening. What happened to them? The woman closed her eyes. Her shoulders tensed. Then, with a single slow movement, she wiped the 4 smaller circles away. Gone. Ethan swallowed hard. They had died. And she had been left here, alone. For how long? The scared planet. Ethan looked at the dead landscape with new eyes. The cracked ground, the silent air, the absence of life. Something had happened here, something horrible. He turned back to the woman. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Her voice was still weak, but she forced out a sound. Lyra. Lyra. A simple name, yet it carried so much weight. Ethan nodded. "I'm Ethan." She looked at him, blinking slowly. Then. It sounded strange when she said it, but there was recognition in her eyes, as if she had heard a name like his before. The unspoken mourning. Ethan helped Lyra sit up against the rock. She was still weak, but her breathing had improved. The food was helping, but something still felt wrong. There was a tension in the air, a silence that felt unnatural. Ethan's instincts were screaming at him. He had been on enough missions to know when something wasn't right. He turned his head slowly, scanning the horizon. That's when he noticed it. A shadow, far in the distance. Not a rock, not a tree. Something else, watching them. Ethan's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if it was human, alien, or something worse. But one thing was clear. They were not alone. The hidden truth. Ethan's muscles tensed as his eyes locked onto the shadow in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest. The barren land had been eerily still just moments ago. Now something, or someone, was watching them. Beside him, Lyra remained weak, leaning against the rock, her breath shallow. She hadn't noticed the shadow yet, but Ethan could see her body stiffen, as if she sensed something was wrong. He swallowed hard. He had a choice to make, confront whatever was out there or retreat into safety. But there was a problem. There was no safety here. A race against time. Ethan's survival instincts kicked in. He had been stranded before, lost in deep space, surrounded by hostile environments. The key to survival was always the same. Stay alert, move quickly, and don't hesitate. He turned to Lyra. "Can you walk?" he asked. She looked at him, her dark eyes filled with exhaustion. Slowly, she tried to push herself up. Her body trembled. Ethan cursed under his breath. She was too weak. He couldn't leave her. That meant one thing. If something was coming, he would have to face it. He grabbed his sidearm, a small energy pistol with limited charge, and stood up. Lyra's eyes widened. She reached out weakly and grabbed his wrist. "No, danger," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "You mean it's not dangerous?" Lyra shook her head, struggling for words. "Not yet." The silent observer. Ethan's grip tightened around his pistol as he stepped forward, scanning the landscape. The shadow was still there, unmoving. The way it blended into the jagged rocks made his skin crawl. Then, without warning, it disappeared. Not like it ran away. Not like it ducked behind something. It just vanished. Ethan's throat went dry. What the hell was that? He turned back to Lyra. Her expression was grim. Watcher. Ethan frowned. Watcher? What does that mean? Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her strength. When she opened them again, there was a strange sadness in them. They come, she said slowly, when it is time to die. A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The underground passage. Ethan didn't like standing in the open. If these watchers came when death was near, he needed to get them both to cover. Is there shelter? He asked. Lyra hesitated, then nodded weakly. Below. Below what? She raised a trembling hand and pointed to the cracked ground beneath them. Ethan followed her gaze. The dry, brittle earth looked like it had been shattered in places. He knelt down, brushing away dust and debris. Then he saw it, a faint, almost invisible metal seam running along the ground. A hatch. His pulse quickened. He dug his fingers into the edge and pulled. At first, it didn't budge. Then, with a grinding sound, the hatch gave way, revealing a narrow, dark opening. Ethan turned to Lyra. This leads somewhere safe. She nodded. Old place. Old. That wasn't exactly reassuring. But at this point, anything was better than staying out here. Without another word, Ethan scooped Lyra up into his arms and carefully lowered them both into the opening. The lost city. The moment they dropped inside, Ethan activated his wrist light. A metal corridor stretched ahead of them, dust covering every surface. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, alien writing, unlike anything he had seen before. Ethan exhaled. This wasn't just a shelter. This was something ancient. He gently set Lyra down against the wall. Her eyes flickered in the dim light, and for the first time, she looked afraid. This place, Ethan said, glancing around. What is it? Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. Home. Ethan's breath caught. He turned his light to the walls, the ceilings, the dust-covered floors. This had once been a city, not just a shelter, a civilization. And now, nothing but ruins, the invasion that erased a species. Ethan helped Lyra move deeper into the underground structure. The further they went, the more the walls were covered in strange carvings and murals. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. A massive wall carving, one that told a story. It showed Lyra's people standing beneath a great sun, their bodies glowing. They looked peaceful, standing together, hands raised toward the sky. But in the next carving, dark figures descended from the sky. Ships, warships. In the third carving, the figures attacked. Lyra's people fell by the thousands. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just a random disaster. This was a massacre. And then, in the final carving, Ethan stepped back in horror. The dark figures weren't aliens. They were human. A deadly truth. Ethan turned to Lyra, his throat dry. This was us. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were filled with pain. Finally, she whispered, "You came, took everything." Ethan felt sick. Humanity had done this. They had wiped out an entire species, stolen whatever they wanted, and left nothing behind but death. And Lyra, she was the last one left. Ethan clenched his fists. This changed everything. He had thought he was stranded on a dead world. But now he realized he was standing on a graveyard, and if humans had been here before, they might be coming back. The betrayal. Ethan stood frozen in front of the massive wall carving, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The truth stared back at him in silent accusation. Humans had been here before, and they had not come in peace. He turned to Lyra, She sat slumped against the ancient wall, her breath still weak, but her dark eyes burned with something raw. Pain, loss, betrayal. Ethan swallowed hard. We did this. Lyra didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted her trembling hand and pointed at another section of the wall. Ethan stepped closer, his wrist light illuminating the final carving. It was worse than he had imagined. The warships in the sky had symbols on them, Earth's military insignia, unmistakable even in alien stonework. This wasn't just some rogue faction. It was an official human operation. The next part of the carving showed columns of alien prisoners, Lyra's people being led away in chains. Others, they weren't so lucky. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had heard stories, old rumors that the early days of humanity's expansion into deep space had been filled with unspoken horrors. Some had called it necessary. Others had called it genocide. Looking at the carvings, Ethan knew the truth. It was genocide. The echoes of the past. Lyra shifted beside him, her voice hoarse but steady. Once, many of us, she whispered. Now, only me. Ethan felt a painful twist in his gut. What did they take? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra looked down, her hands curling into weak fists. Everything. Her glowing silver tattoos flickered weakly. Ethan exhaled. That energy. The markings on your skin. Is that why they came? Lyra nodded. Our life force. Different. She touched her chest. Not like humans. Ethan's mind reeled. Of course, humanity had spent centuries searching for new energy sources, ways to power their ever-growing empire. If Lyra's species had possessed a natural biological energy that humans could exploit, then they weren't just wiped out. They were harvested. Ethan turned away, his hands curling into fists. His people had done this. His species. And if they had been here before, they could come back. A signal in the dark. Ethan activated his wrist communicator, his fingers shaking slightly. His ship was wrecked, but his emergency beacon had been transmitting since the crash. If humans were still monitoring this sector, they would have heard it by now. For the first time, Ethan wasn't sure if that was a good thing. He looked at Lyra. They might be coming. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. To help. Ethan didn't answer. Because deep down, he already knew. They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming for her. The choice. Minutes passed in heavy silence. Then, a crackling noise cut through the air. His communicator. A voice, distorted by static. Carter. This is Earth Fleet Command. We received your distress signal. Status report. Ethan stared at the blinking light on his wrist. The voice was calm, professional. They had no idea what he had just discovered. Or worse, maybe they did. Ethan swallowed hard. I'm alive, he said carefully. But I'm not alone. A pause. Then, clarify. Ethan glanced at Lyra. She watched him, silent, her body still weak, but her eyes burning with quiet understanding. He took a breath. He could tell them the truth. He could say, I found the last survivor of the species we destroyed. Or, he could lie. His mind raced. If he told them about Lyra, they would send a retrieval team. A rescue mission. But not for him. For her. And Lyra wouldn't leave this planet alive. His throat tightened. He had spent his entire career believing in Earth's mission, in the idea that humanity was the pioneer of the stars, bringing civilization and knowledge wherever they went. But standing in the ruins of a world his people had slaughtered, looking at the last survivor of a forgotten race, he knew one thing. Humanity had lied. The voice on the communicator came again, sharper this time. Carter, do you copy? What's your status? Ethan closed his eyes. Then he made his choice. He turned off the communicator. The device beeped angrily as the signal cut out, but Ethan didn't care. He had just betrayed Earth. A future unwritten. Silence filled the underground ruins. Lyra was staring at him, her expression unreadable. Ethan exhaled. "They're coming," he said finally. "We don't have much time." Lyra nodded, as if she had already known this. "Then we go." Ethan looked around at the ruins, at the murals carved into stone. This was her home, her past, and soon it might be destroyed forever. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't leaving her behind. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure where he was going. But one thing was certain. He was no longer on humanity's side, the rescue or the trap. Ethan sat in the darkness of the underground ruins, his back pressed against the cold metal wall. His communicator lay beside him, the screen flickering dimly. The silence after shutting it off felt deafening. Lyra sat across from him, her eyes fixed on him with quiet intensity. Though her body was still weak, there was something in her expression, a silent question. "Why did you turn them away?" Ethan didn't answer, not yet. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, knowing what would come next. He had sent a clear message by cutting off communication. And now, Earth's fleet would send a team to investigate. The problem? They weren't coming to rescue him. They were coming for her. And this time, there would be no survivors. A plan to escape. "We need to move," Ethan said finally, his voice firm. Lyra frowned. "Where?" Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his dust-covered hair. That was the problem. He had no idea where to go. His ship was wrecked, the planet was a wasteland, and once Earth's retrieval team arrived, there would be nowhere to hide. Unless, he turned to Lyra. "Are there any ships left? Any at all?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Old place," she murmured. "Deep below." Ethan's pulse quickened. "A hidden hangar. A chance to escape." "We need to get there," he said. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "Not safe." Ethan scoffed. "Nowhere is safe." And he was right. Because above them, high in the sky, a fleet was already descending. The arrival of the hunters. Ethan and Lyra were still deep within the ruins when they heard it, a low, thunderous hum vibrating through the ground. Ethan knew that sound. Dropships. Earth's military had arrived. Lyra stiffened, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. Her breathing became uneven. Ethan saw the flicker of terror in her eyes. He didn't blame her. The last time her people had seen these ships, they had been wiped out. Ethan clenched his jaw. "They'll scan the surface first," he whispered. "Then they'll send in ground units." Lyra looked at him. "They will not stop." Ethan didn't answer. Because she was right. A fateful encounter. They moved deeper into the ruins, past long-forgotten corridors lined with carvings, past rusted doors that hadn't been opened in centuries. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then they heard voices. Ethan grabbed Lyra's wrist and yanked her into the shadows just as a team of heavily armed soldiers stepped into the corridor. He recognized their armor immediately. Earth Fleet Special Recon. The best of the best. And their leader. Ethan felt his stomach drop. Commander Dorian Reeves. The man was a legend. Ruthless, efficient, and completely loyal to Earth's expansion efforts. Ethan watched as the soldiers scanned the area, their rifles sweeping back and forth. One of them cursed, "This place gives me the creeps." Reeves ignored the comment. His sharp eyes studied the ruins before he spoke into his helmet communicator. "No sign of Carter yet," he said. "But he's here, and so is the target." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. They weren't here for him. They were here for Lyra. And they knew she was alive. The standoff. Ethan's mind raced. He could stay hidden, or he could confront them. But if he confronted them, he would be forced to choose. And deep down, he already knew the answer. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped out of the shadows. The moment he did, every rifle snapped up, aimed directly at his chest. "Hold your fire," Reeves ordered, stepping forward. His cold blue eyes studied Ethan. "You had us worried, Carter. Thought you were dead." Ethan forced a smirk. "You should know by now. I'm not that easy to kill." Reeves didn't smile. "We received your distress signal. What happened?" Ethan hesitated. He could lie, or he could tell the truth. But before he could answer, Reeves's expression hardened. "Where is she?" Ethan clenched his fists. There it was. They weren't even pretending to be here for him. They were hunting Lyra. Betrayal and choices. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I don't know what you're talking about." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Don't insult me, Carter. We know she's alive. We know what she is." He took a slow step forward. "You don't understand, do you? She's not a person. She's a resource." Ethan felt rage burn in his chest. A resource. Reeves kept talking. "Her kind's bioenergy could power entire planets. The last time we were here, we barely scratched the surface. We had to move on before we could finish the job." He smiled coldly. "But now, we can correct that mistake." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "You call wiping out an entire species a mistake?" Reeves's gaze darkened. "It's survival, Carter. Humanity first. Always." Ethan had heard enough. He glanced at Lyra's hiding spot. She was watching, her eyes wide, her hands shaking. He couldn't let them take her. Not after everything she had suffered. Ethan took a deep breath. Then he made his decision. In one fluid motion, he drew his sidearm and shot the first soldier between the eyes, running from humanity. Chaos erupted. Gunfire blazed through the ruins as Ethan grabbed Lyra's wrist and ran. Bullets ricocheted off ancient stone as Reeves shouted orders behind them. Ethan's mind raced. They couldn't fight them all. They had to escape. Lyra gasped. "This way." She pulled him toward a rusted metal door, barely visible beneath layers of dust. Ethan kicked it open and found himself staring at an ancient hangar. And in the center of it, a ship. It was old, alien in design, but intact. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled Lyra inside, his hands flying over the controls. Reeves's voice roared from behind. "Carter, don't do this." But Ethan had already made his choice. With a deafening roar, the engines came to life. And in the blink of an eye, they were gone. The ultimate decision. The stolen ship lurched violently as it ascended through the thin atmosphere, its aging engines groaning under the strain. Ethan gritted his teeth and pulled at the controls, trying to stabilize the craft. The dashboard flickered with alien symbols, warning him of system failures he couldn't even begin to translate. Behind him, Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her breaths coming fast and shallow. Her fingers trembled as she pressed glowing buttons on the control panel. Ethan had no idea if she even knew how to fly this thing. But one thing was clear. They had to get off this planet. Outside, the view through the cracked windshield showed the Earth fleet dropships, their sleek black forms slicing through the purple sky. They were in pursuit. A fight in the skies. The comm system crackled to life. Commander Reeves's voice boomed over the speakers. "Carter, stand down. This is your last warning." Ethan ignored him. He didn't have time for warnings. One of the dropships fired a missile. A split second later, the ship's automated defenses activated. A strange energy pulse erupted from the hull, disrupting the missile mid-flight. Ethan's eyes widened. What the hell was that? Lyra, still weak, struggled to keep her focus. "Ship defends itself," she whispered. Ethan wasn't about to argue. They needed every advantage they could get. He grabbed the controls and veered left, diving between two jagged mountain peaks. The ship groaned under the pressure, warning lights flashing across the console. They wouldn't last long in a dogfight. Reeves's voice came again, sharper this time. "You're throwing your career away, Carter." "For what?" "A dying alien. A dead race." Ethan felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. He had been one of them. A soldier. A loyalist. Someone who believed in humanity's mission to expand, to conquer, to dominate. But now he saw the truth. Humanity hadn't conquered this planet. They had murdered it. and they wanted to finish the job. Ethan's fingers clenched around the controls. "No," he muttered. "Not this time." Then he pushed the throttle forward, and the ship surged toward the upper atmosphere. Breaking through the atmosphere. The sky turned black as they broke through the clouds, the weight of gravity pressing down on them. Ethan's head spun from the force, but he kept his hand steady on the controls. Lyra, beside him, clutched the seat with white-knuckled fingers. Then they were free. The planet below shrank beneath them, a wasteland bathed in eerie twilight. Above them, the vastness of space stretched in every direction. For a moment, Ethan almost allowed himself to breathe. But the relief was short-lived, because ahead of them, floating in orbit, was a massive Earth fleet battleship, and it was waiting for them, face to face with the enemy. A voice came over the comms again, not Reeves this time, but someone higher, someone worse. Ethan Carter. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls. He recognized the voice. Admiral Soren Hale, one of the highest-ranking officers in Earth's expansion fleet, a man who had led entire planetary campaigns and left nothing but ashes behind. "You're in possession of classified biological material," Hale said, his voice calm, calculated. "Surrender the asset, and we will spare your life." Ethan's pulse pounded. The asset. That's what they called her. Not a person, not a survivor, just a resource. Ethan turned to Lyra. She stared at him, her dark eyes filled with something unspoken. Not quite fear, not quite sadness. She had been through this before. She knew what happened to those who surrendered. The ultimate decision. The stolen ship lurched violently as it ascended through the thin atmosphere, its aging engines groaning under the strain. Ethan gritted his teeth and pulled at the controls, trying to stabilize the craft. The dashboard flickered with alien symbols, warning him of system failures he couldn't even begin to translate. Behind him, Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her breaths coming fast and shallow. Her fingers trembled as she pressed glowing buttons on the control panel. Ethan had no idea if she even knew how to fly this thing. But one thing was clear: they had to get off this planet. Outside, the view through the cracked windshield showed the Earth fleet dropships, their sleek black forms slicing through the purple sky. They were in pursuit. A fight in the skies. The comm system crackled to life. Commander Reeves's voice boomed over the speakers. "Carter, stand down. This is your last warning." Ethan ignored him. He didn't have time for warnings. One of the dropships fired a missile. A split second later, the ship's automated defenses activated. A strange energy pulse erupted from the hull, disrupting the missile mid-flight. Ethan's eyes widened. What the hell was that? Lyra, still weak, struggled to keep her focus. "Ship defends itself," she whispered. Ethan wasn't about to argue. They needed every advantage they could get. He grabbed the controls and veered left, diving between two jagged mountain peaks. The ship groaned under the pressure, warning lights flashing across the console. They wouldn't last long in a dogfight. Reeves's voice came again, sharper this time. "You're throwing your career away, Carter. For what?" "A dying alien. A dead race." Ethan felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest. He had been one of them. A soldier, a loyalist, someone who believed in humanity's mission to expand, to conquer, to dominate. But now he saw the truth. Humanity hadn't conquered this planet. They had murdered it. And they wanted to finish the job. Ethan's fingers clenched around the controls. "No," he muttered. "Not this time." Then he pushed the throttle forward, and the ship surged toward the upper atmosphere. Breaking through the atmosphere. The sky turned black as they broke through the clouds, the weight of gravity pressing down on them. Ethan's head spun from the force, but he kept his hand steady on the controls. Lyra, beside him, clutched the seat with white-knuckled fingers. Then they were free. The planet below shrank beneath them, a wasteland bathed in eerie twilight. Above them, the vastness of space stretched in every direction. For a moment, Ethan almost allowed himself to breathe. But the relief was short-lived, because ahead of them, floating in orbit, was a massive Earth fleet battleship. And it was waiting for them, face to face with the enemy. A voice came over the comms again, not Reeves this time, but someone higher, someone worse. Ethan Carter. Ethan's grip tightened on the controls. He recognized the voice. Admiral Soren Hale, one of the highest-ranking officers in Earth's expansion fleet, a man who had led entire planetary campaigns and left nothing but ashes behind. "You're in possession of classified biological material," Hale said, his voice calm, calculated. "Surrender the asset, and we will spare your life." Ethan's pulse pounded. The asset. That's what they called her. Not a person, not a survivor, just a resource. Ethan turned to Lyra. She stared at him, her dark eyes filled with something unspoken, not quite fear, not quite sadness. She had been through this before. She knew what happened to those who surrendered. A new beginning. The ship drifted in the quiet vastness of space, the stars stretching infinitely in every direction. Inside the cockpit, only the hum of the failing engines and the soft, unsteady breathing of Lyra broke the silence. Ethan's hands were still clenched around the flight controls. He hadn't let go since they made the escape jump. His heart still pounded in his chest, his body still tensed for a fight that for now wasn't coming. For the first time in hours, maybe days, there were no enemy fighters on their tail. No Earth fleet warships hunting them down. But that wouldn't last. Ethan exhaled, finally loosening his grip. He turned to Lyra, who sat slumped in the co-pilot's seat, her body exhausted but alive. Her glowing tattoos pulsed weakly, flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. "Hey," Ethan said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "You still with me?" Lyra opened her eyes slowly. She blinked a few times, as if adjusting to the dim lights of the ship. Then she gave the smallest nod. Ethan felt something tight in his chest loosen. She was alive. They had made it, hunted across the stars. Ethan knew better than to celebrate. Earth's fleet didn't just lose people, especially not valuable ones. And Lyra was the last of her kind. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a biological resource that had slipped through their fingers. They wouldn't let that go. His stolen communicator crackled to life on the dashboard. It was a priority transmission. He didn't touch it, didn't answer. But the words played automatically. "Ethan Carter, you are now classified as an enemy of the United Earth Federation. You have aided in the escape of a high-value target. Surrender immediately, and your life will be spared." A pause. Then a voice he knew all too well. "Commander Reeves." "Carter, don't be stupid," Reeves said. "You're running. But you can't run forever." Ethan smirked to himself. "Watch me." He reached forward and ripped the communicator from the console, tossing it aside. He wasn't one of them anymore. "Where do we go from here?" Lyra watched him carefully. "They will not stop," she said quietly. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "I know." He looked at the old alien control panel. "This ship, does it have a homeworld?" Lyra's expression darkened. "Not anymore." Ethan's gut twisted. Of course. Her people were gone. Her home was gone. She had nowhere to go. Neither did he. He ran a hand through his hair. "There has to be somewhere," he muttered. "A place they won't follow." Lyra hesitated, then pointed to the console. "Star map." Ethan blinked. "This thing still has a navigation system." She nodded weakly. Ethan tapped a few buttons on the ancient screen. A massive galactic map unfolded before them. But it wasn't a map of human space. It was old, different, alien. And then, in a distant corner of the galaxy, a small golden symbol pulsed faintly. Ethan pointed at it. "What's that?" Lyra's eyes softened. A chance. That was all Ethan needed to hear. The last stand of a forgotten people. As Ethan adjusted the ship's course, Lyra sat in silence, staring at the glowing tattoos on her arms. He watched her out of the corner of his eye. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, she spoke. "I was never meant to survive." Ethan's chest tightened. She glanced at him, something unreadable in her dark eyes. "But you changed that." Ethan let out a breath. "Yeah, well, I tend to screw up people's plans." A small smile ghosted across her lips. Then, without warning, the ship's alarms blared. Ethan cursed, spinning back to the controls. What now? The long-range sensors had picked up something. Movement behind them. His stomach dropped. The Earth fleet had already found them. The final gamble. Ethan didn't waste time. "They're fast," he muttered, glancing at the incoming blips on the screen. "But can they follow a blind jump?" Lyra looked at him, confused. "A what?" Ethan grinned, even as adrenaline spiked through him. Time to find out. Without warning, he slammed his fist onto the hyperdrive controls. Lyra's eyes widened. "Ethan." The stars blurred. The ship shook violently. The engines screamed in protest. And in the blink of an eye, they vanished into the unknown. A new dawn. When the shaking finally stopped, Ethan opened his eyes. Silence. They were floating in the void again. Alone. He let out a shaky breath. Then he looked at the navigation screen. Their blind jump had worked. The Earth fleet was gone. But as he studied the new star map, something else caught his eye. Ahead of them, in the distance, a planet shimmered in the darkness. Ethan turned to Lyra. "This the place." She stared at the screen for a long time, her glowing tattoos pulsing gently. Then, finally, she nodded. Hope flickered in her gaze. Ethan grinned. "All right, then." He grabbed the controls and set course for the future, the beginning of something new. As the ship soared toward the distant planet, Ethan felt something strange. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't following orders. He wasn't taking orders. He wasn't running from something. He was running toward something. A new beginning. A new story. And this time, it belonged to them.